To remain updated with the latest business news, click on the bell icon.
A very warm welcome once again. Hello and welcome. Namaskar to all of you who are here on behalf of not just the hosts, as well as Mr. Munjal, Professor Souza, and on behalf of Business Today and the India Today group. It's an absolute privilege and honor to be discussing what is clearly a fascinating book. I was surprised, Sunil, and we'll dive right into it, that you kind of taken care of 100 years of history. And I thought as we were getting on the stage that it's not a story just about the making of hero. It's also a story told from the sidelines about the making of India as we can see it today. So I want to begin by asking you to tell all those who are here and those who are also watching us, what was the motivation beyond just scoring and putting down the legacy of your family business?
So thank you, Siddharth, for actually pointing out that in some ways it is India's story. And you're right, because the idea was to try and figure out in concentric circles the story of the company, the family, manufacturing, the nation as it evolved, from a tentative new nation to a much more confident and an emerging nation, and also at the same time what was happening in the world. So twofold. One, of course, the story of the family and what they did, building in one generation an enterprise which produced multiple successful companies, but more than just companies, the impact that it had on people and society. I think that was an important story that needed to be told, but also how India in its early days, through the struggle of independence to becoming an independent nation and how to develop its economy, what it did, I thought it would be an interesting combination to put these two together. The request for writing a book on my father or the family or the companies had been coming for decades, actually, 20 or 30 plus years. And his normal response would be, nahi, apne bare mein baat nahi karte. Yeah? It's not nice to talk about yourself. After 25 years of requests, he finally agreed. And unfortunately, we lost him before that could be written. And we had actually appointed a team to do this. Subsequently, the request still came. So I thought it's a story that, since he had agreed, we should write. And who would know this better than someone from the inside?
That's a wonderful point that you make, and you've written a insider's account. I would say it's candid, and I know that if you feel like it, you'll probably be able to churn out 3 or 4 similar books. You can do sequels, because that's the amount of letters, for example, that you have received, and you alluded to that in the book. I'm going to try and keep this like a rapid fire. So the first question that I want to take to you, a lot of people say Startup India and the birth of entrepreneurship. I want to counter that by saying that India, which you also mention in the book, had been deindustrialized for several centuries, has been a startup nation. In your experience, as we talk about startups, and we have perhaps just about 50 unicorns currently, navigating from a controlled license Raj economy to a situation where Indian companies and families learn to interface and work with foreign partners who had access to larger amounts of capital and, of course, technology, to a situation that prevails now. Without taking names, we are now talking about Indian education company that's looking at listing at a $48 billion valuation. So imagine those numbers. Sunil, give us that sense of the span and arc of history in terms of business.
So actually, you could have asked Sanjay this question, because Sanjay and his family have just done something similarly miraculous only recently. But you're right. Startups as a concept is not new. Our company was a startup in the early 50s, as were many, many others, which are today standing established organizations. just the concept of startups based heavily on technology, new knowledge, connectivity, and driven by e-commerce is a relatively new concept. Also, the amount of innovation that's going into the current ideation of the concept of these new startups, I think, is very creditable. But I do, and I've said this actually multiple times, I don't think startups as a concept is new in India. It's been around for a long time. I do sometimes worry that our focus becomes excessively only on a few and only those who have achieved valuations of billions of dollars. The startups are coming up in tens of thousands across the nation and doing all kinds of amazing things. I'm actually very keenly interested. As Sanjay said, we are actually supporting many of them, especially those who are doing things which have a positive impact on society. There are many of them in a whole host of areas of logistics, of waste management, of eco-friendly technologies. It's just amazing what all is going on. And I think we need to figure out a way to encourage them more and more.
I'll also bring in Professor D'Souza into the conversation. But before I do that, I'm going to honestly recommend this as a management graduate myself, this book to everyone, whether you are a student, aspiring manager, someone even chasing billion-dollar valuations. There are a lot of insights in this book. Two key dates that stand out, and when I was reading this book, I kind of noticed that the arc of everything that was good and bad about the industrial controls in India is captured in this book without doubt. For example, and it's interesting that we are talking about it a few days or weeks after the farm laws were repealed. Private wholesale food grain trade was abolished in 1973. The JV that kind of made the group what it is and made them leapfrog from where they were, took 3 years of due diligence from Japanese Honda, 3 years of due diligence. And Sanjay would probably know better whether any investor or entrepreneur will have the patience for a 3-year due diligence. All of these incidents, in hindsight, for a company that is so Swadeshi, partnering with a foreign company, staying with them for so many years, and then kind of going your own separate paths, how would you categorize that experience, and what are the top 2 or 3 lessons that you would like to share with us?
So I think one was the recognition that while in bicycles and mopeds we were quite successful, but we knew very little about businesses beyond that which had higher automation, more technology used, specifically the two-wheeler business. And the government of India had opened a small window at that time for joint ventures for two-wheelers. And that's when many of the giant companies came in. Yamaha came in, Suzuki came in with the TVS, Yamaha came in with Escorts, and Kawasaki came in with Bajaj. And Honda had looked around. They were the last ones, incidentally. They had looked around and spent a lot of time. 140 companies had applied from India for this partnership to Honda because it was a giant and a leader even at that time. And the last 20 companies were visited multiple times by them. It was quite an experience, that itself. And maybe a separate book can be written only about that, by the way. And at the end of it, they probably knew more about us than we knew ourselves. Not probably, almost definitely. Because they would come with their cameras, there were no smart devices in those days, and diaries, and note every single thing you said. And it was interesting, on a second or third or fourth visit, they would ask a question, and if you responded, they said, but this is what you said 6 months ago. And this is something different you said 6 months ago. In our case, the thing is, as Indians, we are normally instinctive in our response. We are not as studied as they are. So there was a great deal of learning from them. What made that partnership special? In fact, McKinsey, or one of the big consulting firms, wrote an article once saying this is the longest running large global joint venture of a Japanese company in the world. And we don't think it's because of the Japanese partners.
It's because of there's a very good anecdote, and I'm just going to take 2 words and let Sunil expand on that. Dekhi Jayegi was a pivotal moment when, at the very last moment, and I would say that if you gone to marry X and suddenly you were asked to marry Y. That was a situation. And added to that a question, do you think it was a stroke of luck and fate that you ended up making motorcycles?
So, as is acknowledged very often by successful leaders, luck has a lot to do with success. Many things around us, first, the blessings of the Almighty are something we don't often credit enough. And then many things around us falling into place at the right time, right place. What Siddharth is referring to is the last conversation that was held between Hero and Honda on this partnership. In Tokyo, the Japanese told my father that we are willing to partner with you. This is when they brought the list down from 20 to the last 2. But we will offer you a motorcycle and not a scooter. Please remember, India was a scooter country in those days. So there was a little bit of hesitation. So my father picked up the phone and called my uncle, Om Prakashi. And he said, this is what has been said. And my uncle got a shock. He said, but how can we do that? My father said, ye bhi dekh lenge. If this is an opportunity, we will make it work. As we have done many times earlier, because they had started, please remember, they had started from scratch with nothing. And they built that business to where it got to. And that, in some sense, he actually said, we will do this, but we will define some of the specifications that we want, which are appropriate for the Indian market, despite the Japanese offering a slightly different set of specs. I don't know if that is covered in the book or not. The specs they offered were different from what was actually picked finally.
Well, I noticed there was a debate about the 100cc and the pricing, of course.
Yes, and they wanted to offer an 80cc 75, which was very popular in the Southeast, in Indonesia and Vietnam and in all of those countries. And my father and our team, my brother Ramanji, incidentally, was the founding CEO of this company. We lost him, as you know, in 91. And Bhavan was also along. And they insisted that we want 100cc because it has to be a heavy load carrier in India, as we had done in bicycles. And they knew where the success of the bicycle came from. It had to be low priced and it had to be sturdy at the same time. It had to be sophisticated in technology, but easy to maintain. So there was some conflicting...
And give you a lot of mileage as well.
So that was one of the features which actually also made it distinctive, as you know.
There's one very interesting passage in the book, and this is about how your late father went into great detail in terms of engineering about the load-bearing capacity, not just of the motorcycle, but about the original cycles, because there's an anecdote about how 3 brothers would themselves use one cycle, and many of us here would perhaps recall those days. Professor D'Souza, if I can bring you in, because Sunil, as the book has been written, it's a very simple book. It's a management book. I would highly recommend it, but it's been written in a layman's tone and tonality, so it has great appeal. Yet let's try and bring in some management jargon. This is a group that has seen a lot of downfalls. It's seen loss, it's seen the heights of profitability, and then a sudden black swan event wiping it all away. In management terms, what does the lesson about the Hero Group, the making of the group and where it stands today, represent for the current generation of entrepreneurs and businessmen in India?
I actually would like to start by saying that it's not just a management book. It's also a book about history.
Yes.
And you know what's central to me about the book is the culture of the family and how that, I think, was the basis by which they could do all the great things that they did. Specifically, you know, what stands out to me is 2 things. One is strong sense of honesty, okay, which in business, as we know, it can take you both ways. There's this wonderful story in the book about the time when, you know, there was a lack of food in India, and one of the brothers found food somewhere in a barn or something and brought it home. And the grandfather said, please, just take it back. We may be hungry, but someone may have stored this food out of great risk. And it's important that that family does not get denied because of what we do. Okay? That is a sense of honesty that, you know, if you can be honest in a time of crisis, you know, I mean, you sort of sowed the seeds of greatness.
Before I go back to Sunil, just one quick point, and this is again for those because sometimes it becomes very fashionable and trendy to blame business, sare corporate chore, and there was a phase in the recent past. I'm not going into the politics of it, but if you look at the arc, and since you said about history, if we trace India's industrial history, business history, there was a phase of great capital controls going to the Sarkar for everything. Then there was this period of opening 3-4 decades back, and there was a bit of Wild West capitalism. And to the current phase, sir, how would you describe the current phase of the business landscape today in India?
No, I think, one of the things that, Sanjay said was striking about the group, the way in which you manage capital. Okay. If there's one thing, which is anathema to me as a management educator, and, it's what the group represents, is that the group is totally against debt. Okay, I mean, it is a group which basically believes in somehow economizing on capital and sort of taking that forward, And I think, that is a sort of a rarity in Indian business. To me, it's so natural that, if you want to grow, you take on debt. I mean, it's not an issue.
Sunil, come in on this because taking on debt is very natural. And I'm not talking about the NPA crisis. I'm talking in terms of startups, and companies are taking on debt, plus, of course, venture equity financing. And there is no roadmap for profitability. How does that fly in the face of what he just pointed out?
So, Errol is right. In our organization and in our family, we have been very risk averse as far as debt is concerned. We've taken plenty of risks in business, by the way, on products and services, on markets and technologies. But debt is something we've tried to stay away from, against criticism from many analysts who'd say, because you guys don't borrow, you're not going fast enough. Our question was, you show us a company that's growing faster. And we're doing this with our own resources. What can actually be better? We actually borrowed in the early days of what was then Hero Honda. We borrowed from IFC Washington. And in 2 years, we prepaid them. So anytime I meet anyone from World Bank, they always remind me that you are one of our examples of somebody who we are happy with and also very unhappy with.
Was this a cultural thing, or was this a business practice that you followed?
It's both. And Sanjay is right. We've always attempted to keep a negative working capital cycle. Mm-hmm. So we were able to get advances or current payments from most of our customers, and suppliers had a payment period, but that payment period was always maintained strictly. We never delayed any supplier's payment. In Ludhiana, since you're talking of old time, in Hero Cycles, every Saturday afternoon, the payments were made to suppliers. It was well known the payments would be made from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock. There was a window in one of the offices where they would come and just collect their checks. Anyone could write their own check if they knew they was expecting one from Hero Cycles. And if they didn't come at 5 o'clock, the check was actually mailed to them. And that was a completely unusual practice in this country. And maybe to some extent it still is. So my advice to many of the startups that we work with is take debt, but watch your cash.
Okay. And this is very important advice because a lot of youngsters who might be watching this, people who are wishing to start up or have probably already begun the journey, one of the key factors that is different in today's business landscape in India is access to capital. Sanjay knows this and he's funded some very big names in Indian business currently. You yourself have spawned God knows how many companies. How different is the access of capital now versus 30 years back when you were, perhaps getting your feet established in the business?
Certainly very different. It's not just that there is more access, there is more variety of funding instruments available. You can create many layers under which you can actually take debt. And some companies have done that. To an extent, it's beneficial, but beyond a point, I think it's very dangerous because it lulls you into a sense of comfort without realizing you take debt in entities which have no cash flows, which don't have revenues. And banks were, by the way, and banks and NBFCs were happy to give that money. But at the end of the day, you need a source for servicing and repayment. So in our case, if we do take, we by the way, we don't never take debt, but we hardly ever take debt. When we do take debt, we want to ensure, even more than the banks giving us the money, that we have the ability to not just service it, but to pay it many times over.
One of the other things, and I don't know how many people in this audience would know that there's another storied business family from Ludhiana. Sunil shares his first name with the key person there. I'm talking about what was originally founded as Mitbaros, Sunil Mittal. And they, of course, went overseas. They have a large telecom network in the African continent. The context of the question is, for your group, which has exported, I don't know how much in terms of volume and value, why weren't you, at least in public perception, part of that phase where a lot of Indian companies went global and said, we've done India, now we have to rule over the world, and many of them have done pretty well. Many have been bitten very badly.
So we did go overseas, but in a different manner. So we were exporting to 90 countries, by the way. So we set up assembly plants in some of the countries. Sri Lanka was the first one I can think of. This is going back 3 or 4 decades. Now for the two-wheelers, there's an assembly plant in Bangladesh, assembly plant in Colombia, in Africa. So we've done this, but we've done this with connected businesses. What you're talking about is people who went and acquired companies across the globe. So we have always been, our strategy has always been very conservative. The aggression is reserved for operations, not for strategy.
Okay. How many in this hall know the story behind how this group came to be branded Hero? I won't come to you, but is there anyone who can raise his hand? No, I'm ruling you out as a professor of business education. Is there anyone else? Okay, so that brings me to the next question. Tell us the story about how the brand Hero came into being.
You're talking of a time long before things like intellectual property registration, etc., came to be. When it was common for us to pick any name and use them. When my father and 2 of my uncles were doing trading of bicycle parts in Amritsar, and around partition time, one of the people they were dealing with used to make saddles, and his brand was Hero. He was going back to what became Pakistan, and my uncle asked him, do you mind, we like this name, do you mind if we use Hero? He's saying, how can I mind? It's up to you, you use it. And it was that simple. And that, of course, over a period of time became inextricably linked to what we do as a business and as a family. But the beginning was not a grand plan. Exactly like the business. The business was not started with the plan to build the biggest company in the world. It was started as a business to survive and provide for the family. I think it's just the good practices. And to Errol's point, the philosophical underpinnings in how it was practiced that actually allowed it to grow.
That's a very interesting cue for me. But before I go to that, I want to request you to tell our audience, when was the first time you were involved in a formal business plan, the kind that is absolutely necessary today? No venture financer would let anyone even inside the door unless there were 15, 20, 30 slides, top quality. When did you see such a plan full of management jargon?
So our businesses, when they started, were obviously instinctive businesses, started by, as I said, my father and his brothers. But as they kept growing, and they did grow. So one of the things that happened, I'm going to take a little bit of a story before I come there, if you don't mind. When they started making bicycles, the first thing that happened was the government of India at that time, Manubhai Shah was the industry minister, Jawaharlal Nehru was the prime minister. They were very keen to build Indian manufacturing in small industry. They felt that large industry would only be public sector, steel plants, dams, etc. The small manufacturing could be small industry. And the Punjab chief minister at that time, Pratap Singh Kaira, was very keen to develop industry in Punjab and agriculture at the same time. So they encouraged my father to apply for this license. So 128 companies got licensed to make bicycles in one day in India. I don't know how many, 20 or 30 of them were in Ludhiana itself. So that was the beginning of Hero Cycles. My father went and returned the license. People said, you must be crazy. Because license in India used to be licensed to print money because everything was always in short supply. He's saying, we want a license, but not one restricted to small scale. I don't want to be held back. We want to be able to do what we can do. Fortunately, the license got changed to the condition for small scale was removed, and they made 7,500 bicycles year one, and they just never looked back. But what they found was you couldn't make as many bicycles as you could sell. Because what the British had done was entire value addition in everything, including the bicycle industry, was taken out to the UK. So things like hubs, tires, chains, rims, pedals, all used to come from freewheels, all used to come from companies like Dunlop and Raleigh from England and was sold through what were called agency houses. So they said, this won't do. If you get 1,000 tires, you can only make 500 bicycles. So they went around asking family and friends, are you interested in make bicycle parts? We can help you select what to make, how to make it, what machines to use. But two things we will not do for you. We will not fund the business for you. We will not run the business for you. Okay? You have to be your own entrepreneur. And by the way, we may be cousins of friends out here, but the moment we enter the office, we are business associates. So this concept of arm's length pricing, transactions being done in an impartial manner was actually set up right from the beginning at that time. So in some sense, they did start to plan, but in a different way. From the question you're asking, I know you're leading on to a different, so I just thought I'll mention something which is a little bit interesting as well. And that's when the first plant also by the family was set up to make chains, and then later on hubs, which became Rockman Cycle, then Highway. And then many of these companies became component suppliers, built a wonderful concentration until Ludhiana became the largest bicycle component maker in the world.
Absolutely.
And set up a supply chain system.
Absolutely. Professor, since we are talking about the pre-independence phase, the deindustrialization and agency houses, I just want to ask you, companies like Hero represent Swadeshi manufacturing even before the word became fashionable in the media. There was a phase of reforms which impacted manufacturing within India, and the philosophy was, let's import. And that's happened across sectors. Now you, of course, see a policy push. In terms of where we stood vis-a-vis China, and there's a very interesting anecdote about China also in this book. Do you think that we stand a chance as far as manufacturing is concerned? Can large manufacturing enterprises like Hero be set up now?
I'm going to be a little frank on this one. The answer is no. It requires strong entrepreneurial skills. India, you look at the path of history, never encouraged manufacturing. And I believe even with Make in India today, that is not strictly true. Okay, if you look at, say, a manufacturing economy, think of China. As economies develop, agriculture reduces in scope, and then you become industrialized, and finally a services economy. India at independence was something like 70% agriculture. Today it's 14%. Okay, you should have seen that gap in industry. In fact, it's services. And the story there is the story that Sunil is telling. It's about how the license Raj actually stunted Indian industry. The way the banking system was run, the way finance was basically grew in the country. And the thing that, all entrepreneurs were always, in some sense, seen as tainted and too close to politics. Okay, what we would call as cronyism. Okay, so it's difficult. I'm not saying it can't be done and it's not done. Okay, there are, some outstanding examples. But I think those go against the grain for one very simple reason. They have a very strong culture, which is, what the Hero Group is also about. It's a culture of building relationships and being very frank about it. One of the astounding things to me in a family business is that, you have the back of everybody, but at the same time, you are, very frank about how they need to operate. There's this lovely story about how one of the brothers who did the distribution was not finding customers, and the other brother calls up and says, doesn't look like you're good at this, come back home. Okay. It's like, rap on the knuckles, and then this guy took it, on his shoulders, went across the country, in a third-class reserved compartment, stayed in the cheapest of hotels, and finally got the biggest customer base by building goodwill. I mean, what we
and
would
then
call
his brother
goodwill.
noticed and gave instructions for that to change.
Yeah.
Sunil, this is the point I want to ask you, because this point about joint families came up. Let me ask you very straight up, why was there a family rearrangement? And I'm not using the word split, it was a reorganization, an amicable reorganization. Couldn't joint family and your kind of family with the moorings in the culture that it has stayed together as a business?
So actually, this is a very important aspect of business. First, amongst my father and his brothers, there was unbelievable coordination and understanding, complete trust on each other. Each one was distinctly different in their style and character and behavior, but complementary to the other. Yeah? And I think that was a wonderful, wonderful relationship and an operating system at the same time. In the morning, my father and uncle, they lived in the same house, two twin homes without a wall. So when they were shaving, they were talking about business. Sitting at the table, they were talking about what's going on. So all of us, by osmosis, learned a lot of that. I myself got a fair bit of exposure because I got involved in the family business network, looked at how family businesses were run worldwide. As a subject, I had lectured on this in many parts of the world. So I actually went to my father and my uncle and I said, we should consider this. We should consider restructuring, because each generation of ours has been brought up differently. We have sent our younger generation to better and better institutions for education, encourage them to be independent minded. And when they come back, if we tell them, you should do what I'm telling you, that would be unfair. That's not the right thing to do. And at any time, any of them would stand up and say, but I don't want to do this, I want to do something else. And they actually got upset with me, both of them. They said, exactly to the point you're making, that people give examples of our family, how the family is so close and how we work so well and the businesses are doing so well. I said, exactly. Who thinks of doing it at this time? The norm is this starts when families either have a fight amongst the members of the family or when some business is going downhill. And then everyone is pulling in a different direction. You will not have an amicable reorganization. And we did. We had a restructuring, which the first time the world heard of this was when we announced it ourselves, that it's actually been done. It was done deliberately. It was done thoughtfully.
And it
done
took
in a manner
almost
that
3 years plus to...
It took almost 4 years, yeah.
Almost 4 years.
Yes.
That's very interesting. And a quick point on this too. Those who are now building up businesses and will become mature businesses in the future, what would you tell them when it comes to, separating the family part and the professionals part in today's context?
So an interesting thing that I learned when I looked at family businesses around the world is that about 80+% of the issues are common around the globe. The solutions, however, is unique for every individual family. The one thing which was common was that there are some, and it's well known now, 94% of the family-owned businesses will destroy themselves in the third generation. And that's recorded. It's enough research to show that. The interesting thing is the 6% go on and on and on beyond that. Now, what's distinctive about the 6% is the lesson that one needs to learn. One is the ability to clearly distinguish between ownership and management. That's the number one lesson. Too few of us understand, accept, or spend any time on this. The normal understanding in a majority of family-owned businesses, if I have the same last name, I have a right to this job or role. And I think that's automatically destroys culture, value, understanding, regard, and respect. And that takes you downhill. If the members of the family are actually put through the drill tougher than any professional, Their appraisal and assessment is good quality, and the feedback is objective, which is rare, but it's exactly to the point you're making, Errol. If the family member is told, this is not okay, you can't do this. And the other thing I think is too many people get forced to do things that they don't like. So what we did, other than restructuring, was we've encouraged the young people in the family to follow their passion. We have a fashion designer in the family. We have a chocolatier in the family. We have someone running a university in the family. And we have said, you can actually afford to do this, so please go and do it.
Isn't that also true because they didn't have to survive like...
That's what I'm saying. I think because we have the ability to make choices and say yes or no, it would be a shame then to force everybody to do what I think is right. What I think is right may be right for me. It may not be right for you.
Absolutely. How about the split with Honda? It was a partnership that was crafted over the years and it was very successful. How did that pan out? What was the result for the entire group?
So this partnership ran for 27 years. In the first 10 to 12 years, we learned a lot from Honda. And they were an amazing partner. They are literally miles ahead in the way they think of technology, of design, and their ability to be meticulous in not only in planning, but also in execution is amazing. In the last 15 years of the partnership, lots and lots of ideas went from here into their system. These companies became successful. Please remember the culture of doing this was already there in the Hero Cycle and Majestic Auto days. We've been doing this in many companies, in Highway and Rockman and many, many others. And I think that both made them happy and made them upset, because here's an upstart coming out of nowhere, suddenly has become the largest company in the world. Please remember, the company we beat to become number one was Honda itself. And also we had signed 2 or 3 conditions at the start. In '84, Japan was where it was, India was where it was, and we were a company who had no clue about this business when we were entering. That R&D would be done in Japan, which is very good, because Japan was the world leader. Please remember when this was done. And that any export out of India would happen with Honda's prior permission. So because that was not forthcoming and they had set up their own 100% owned subsidiary, it seemed only fair that they concentrate and focus on theirs while we focus on our entity, to allow both of them room and scope to grow. And it was a difficult decision to make, but clearly that time for that had come, which is why we were able to do it in a nice, friendly way, so that each one went their own way, and we are now competitors. But as individuals, we are still friends.
Why not compete? Why didn't you consider competing in the 4-wheeler space? Why stick to 2-wheelers?
So we did think about 4-wheelers a few times. We even had conversations with Honda actually to partner. But we wanted to make sure that we would be in the driving seat in any such partnership. Also, that 4-wheelers was becoming a very, very tough market. You must remember, other than Maruti, most other companies in India struggle to even make money, much less to be thriving. And so we were again, going back to the cautious strategy. We didn't think it was actually timely or smart for us to get into that business. So we started diversifying. We went into clean energy, we went into financial services, we went into other areas. As I said at the start, we don't publicize everything we do, but we had 32 companies the day we restructured. I think that is in the book. And today, across the group, while they are separately owned, there must be 50 or 60 companies.
Sunil, I just want, as a business leader, to ask you about the future of electric mobility, because that's the big buzzword, and I cannot not ask you that question here.
So, as far as clean energy is concerned, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. That's clear. The direction for the whole world is clear. India has made its decision. Every company in India has started moving in that direction. 2 things, however, I actually said this a little bit earlier to someone else. The technology for electric vehicles is not new. It's been around for 100 years. It's just that the existing companies, with the sunk costs that they had already invested, were not willing to venture out. It's only when newbies, to your point, the startups, who are either computer companies or doing something completely different, said, I'm going to put 2 seats and 4 wheels on this computer, and this is my new car. That shook up the entire industry. And the awareness of the quality impact on the air quality of polluting vehicles was coming more and more into focus in the last few years. So this shift had to come. It is still not clear to me what is the ideal technology, what will win out in a long period of time. But today, the electrically motor-driven vehicle clearly is the winning one. I don't know if it's the one which will link the long-term war. This battle, clearly it's winning. And I don't know of any automotive company in the world which is not shifting to that.
In terms of our automotive sector, the Japanese and Maruti are credited with creating a completely new revolution as far as four-wheelers are concerned. Are you able to pin down as to who will be the equivalent of Japan and Maruti in the e-mobility space?
It's very hard to say. So there are two diametrically opposite views on this. One is that the startups who are coming have no baggage. So they can just bring in all the newest stuff and then take off from there. The other view is, while the startups, some of them, by the way, are already in and have an edge in terms of timing, that, please remember, it's not always the first mouse which catches the cheese. So the large companies have resources, distribution, dealerships, ability for upkeep and maintenance, and also the ability to provide financing models, which some of the new ones may not. So the answer is not easy. I do believe some of the existing large enterprises will come back with the bang from where they are right now.
So what you're saying is it's easy to probably do a flash sale on an e-commerce portal and brand it well, but selling an automobile product is a 10-year, 5-year, 15, 20-year engagement, at least till the life of the vehicle. And it's not just about selling it.
Yeah. So when you sell it, your relationship starts. It doesn't end that day.
It's not sell it and forget it. It's a continuation. Just a couple of quick points before I hand it back to Professor Vishal Gupta. This is a question that I ask every business leader, so I'm going to do that once again. Are entrepreneurs born? Do they have a fair share of higher luck than the average individual? And can entrepreneurship be taught, or is it just within your DNA? Big question, try and give us an answer on that.
So I'll give you half the answer. I'll suggest Errol should give the second half. I can give it, but I think he can probably do a better job.
And I'll probably get a mic to Sanjay on that as well.
So the belief earlier was that entrepreneurs are only born. And it's genetic, that people who run good enterprises, their progeny will continue to have the skill to run more enterprises. We find today that's actually not true. It's not limited only to a few. People who are willing to take a risk, people who are willing to lead by example, people who are willing to take that leap and have the empathy for people around them. I'm not even talking about business now. The qualities of a leader are actually qualities of a business leader as well. Any successful leader, if you look at them, there are 4 or 5 things that actually set them apart from others. It is exactly the same for entrepreneurs.
Professor?
Well, I think the family is a good example of, how do you answer this question? His father started out 5 years on a farm, okay? Who would have thought that he would get into cycles, okay? Then he works for an ordnance factory, which produces, they're doing repairs of cycles. So he learned something out there. So, I think entrepreneurship is a matter of luck, but it's also a matter of recognizing that this is my calling. And I'm going to invest my whole being into this. There's no two ways about it. I can't step back even 2%, because if I do, that business is going to go nowhere. Okay? Do entrepreneurs, are all entrepreneurs going to be successful, and is it in the genes? No. We have good examples of that. The Vanderbilt was like one of the biggest entrepreneurs in the world, built a large wealth fund, etc. 3 generations down, everyone was living in penury. Okay, the largest Indian family in Singapore which was, I don't want to take any names, which was the wealthiest family, within a generation ran out of all the wealth. Okay?
So, sir, if I may interrupt you, you've taught probably thousands of students. Why is it that venture capital only chases IIT and IIM brand names? To a large extent, there are a lot of exceptions as well. And when we do these shows, a lot of people come up and say, hey, I have this burning desire inside me and I know I can do it, but I don't have that tag on my card.
It's just selection, pure selection. I mean, we select the best. And so, it's just that, I mean, maybe, I believe we just add a little bit of value to them. They are actually very entrepreneurial by the time they've even joined us. And then they just go on to live their dreams. I mean,
as a percentage, sir, is there a difference? If you went back in history, you would see that a big percentage of entrepreneurs who had made it big had perhaps very little education. But now there is obviously more education available. Can you comment on that? Is it necessary? Can a person who is not educated formally and significantly hope to become a large businessman?
If he's not educated, he needs to have experience. That's the big difference today, I would say. Education is so important, mainly because most, anything that you do today has got to have a tech edge to it. If you don't pick up the tech in an educational institution, you got to pick it up by working somewhere.
So Sunil, knowledge of software is right next to English.
Let me just add to that.
Yeah.
One thing that essential is passion. Okay? If you have the passion, you make the time to learn. You will find the energy to do things. Working 18, 20 hours a day is not a problem at all.
Pardon me for interrupting you, but if you don't know coding, will passion alone be enough?
So what we are doing, incidentally, our family foundation runs many schools. We've made coding compulsory from class 3 in school.
Wonderful.
So it becomes one of the languages you learn.
Absolutely.
It's as much as Hindi or English or in any other languages that we are saying this should be a native language to everybody, as many young people in India as possible, because this will become a tool for their survival, not just for growth, even for survival, it will become essential.
And I sincerely believe that more than some of the maths that is taught in our schools, probably teaching Excel is far more important. Can we get a mic to Sanjay here on that same question?
While you do that,
Yeah.
I should also tell you, increasingly world over, 2 parts of education have now increased. One is on family-owned businesses. Second is on entrepreneurship. In addition to management, which is around for a long time, these 2 are now formally being taught across many, many institutions across the globe, including in India.
Absolutely.
You want me to address what?
Okay.
No. Look, I know the question. I think one of the things is that entrepreneurship, I think, requires a lot of hard work. I think you spoke about passion and experience, but I think also great execution. Yeah. And this coding and software technology is one part. I've met 2 entrepreneurs in the last 2 days, and you can't imagine, they're nothing to do with coding and technology. One guy makes tires for scooters and tires for big tractors. Amazing business guy, probably going to do 250 crores of EBITDA, and probably the value of his business is going to be over $1 billion. Okay, there's just tire manufacturing. He's just good at what he does. And I met another guy who's just doing different kinds of asset management businesses and making a massive platform quietly. Nobody's heard about this guy. So I think it's the passion. It's picking a couple of key areas that you really like. But I think a lot of hard work and good execution. Business planning and all that, they teach us at Ahmedabad, but frankly, it's a lot of execution.
Sanjay, in a tech-driven world, what is essential? And one last point, could someone create a hero again in the present time, the way it was done and as is captured in the book?
I think it's tough to replicate exactly that. It's tough. It's not easy. Not easy.
So
I mean, we'll see what
can
happens
be
in
done.
electric
It can be
vehicles.
done
We'll see.
differently.
Yeah,
It can be done
differently. Yeah.
It would need a different set of tools. It will need a different set of operating practices. But you're right about there. Ideas are cheap.
Yeah.
It is about execution.
Absolutely. And execution is the word that I want to leave you all with. You heard from the masters. You heard from people who have really built businesses and taught business. Before I hand it over to Professor Vishal Gupta, many thanks to all of you for your leadership.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.